Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. The Terminator was a phenomenon and is a franchise that still gives people a glimmer of hope whenever a new installment is announced. Killer robots from the future sent back to kill the people that beat them in the future is such a simple but effective premise, and one that was apparently ripped off from an old episode of The Twilight Zone, or was it The Outer Limits? I never know which one is which. Anyway, you guessed it, there are video games, so let's look at way too many of them to see if any of them are worth saving, or should we send back a robot from the future to erase them and say things like hasta la vista. Now, how about I shut the hell up, you press that subscribe button, get some clothes, boots and a motorcycle, and we take a look at some games. We're going to do this in kind of movie order, so let's go. Let's start with the Terminator on the NES. This is a side-scrolling action game, like most of the games you'll be seeing, where you take control of future soldier and father to humanity's saviour, Kyle Reese. The game sort of follows the plot of the movie about as much as any licensed game does, as you start out in the future fighting through Skynet, defeating Terminators in order to travel back in time. At least that's what I'm assuming, as the game is so broken in just about every way that I wasn't able to get very far at all. The graphics are almost passable, and the characters might look okay, other than they look like the sort of thing you'd get if you asked your 5-year-old brother to draw a Terminator. It's impressive that this was made by adults. Most of the backgrounds look like they're glitched out, but no, that's just how they look. You have two attacks, a gun and a grenade. The gun has unlimited ammo, but you can't move and shoot. Instead, you do this awkward crouch. You can aim diagonally up while still crouching, but that's it. It makes combat very hard, and your gun makes an annoying noise too, which gets very tedious very fast. You can swap to grenades with the select button. These have a small arc, but can destroy a lot of enemies in just one hit. Also, as this is one of those crap games, there are enemies that are too low for you to shoot, so you have to use your grenades on them, but you get a limited supply of them. This doesn't really help though, as lazily placed gun turrets that aren't even placed on actual scenery half the time will just eat away your health. And if they don't kill you, the terrible platforming will. The collision detection is awful here, and you have to do a lot of annoying platforming, but most of the time you'll just fall through the platforms if you don't land on them perfectly. It's terrible, and that just really sums up this game. It's terrible. Schedule for termination. The Master System version is very different. You still play as Kyle Reese, but here you really are in the middle of the war. It actually looks pretty cool, apart from the crap animation. Your main weapon to start with are grenades, and actually these are quite annoying. They're slow to use, and you stop when you throw them. Of course, enemies will use this time to shoot you, though to be fair you can actually stop their shots with a well-placed grenade. But still, this is another game that just kinda sucks. It's stupidly hard with enemies constantly spawning in, not giving you a chance, and there doesn't appear to be any health pickups at all. You'll find a gun quite early on, which is nice, and it does make things a lot easier, but you still can't move while attacking. The first level alone is really hard to beat, and that's thanks to the relentless enemies and no health. Of course, this is also one of those bullshit games where if you die just once, it's game over and back to the very start for you. Unfortunately, this is just not really fun to play. Even when you've played it for a while and kinda get used to it, it's still not fun. It's a chore to play, and another one that really makes you question the developers and their reasoning behind making it the way they did. There was also a version released for the Game Gear that's basically identical to this, but with slightly worse graphics, so you can ignore that one too. Amazingly, the Mega Drive, or Genesis version if you're a sexy masked Keaton, is the same game, but made a bit more playable, but not a lot. It looks much better with some really nice animation here, but again the onslaught of spawning enemies just make this thing a pain to play. However, there is a big difference. Enemies drop health power-ups here. This actually makes the game kind of fair, but not quite, as you still only get one life before it's game over. The levels do have a different layout here too, but not by much, and the enemies certainly look a lot better. Thankfully, they're all dumb as hell, and you can pretty much just crouch to avoid most of their attacks, and you can actually farm enemies to get your health back in some places. Thanks to these generous additions to the game, I was able to make it to the second level before I just lost interest. This is another classic case of a game having so much potential, but the developers gave you one life with no continues, passwords or saves, and that is it. I would say don't bother with this game, but if you must play one and don't have access to any CD-based systems, this is probably your best bet. The Super Nintendo version of the Terminator is a more traditional run and gun, but it still sucks. The graphics aren't horrendous, and in fact some parts of the game look alright, but your character just looks really out of place. This is another rock solid game. Here you do actually get a few lives, and along the way you can collect a rapid fire weapon, homing rockets and grenades. Again, you start in the future fighting Terminators, and yep, it's stupidly hard, as they will shoot you from off screen and often at a place where they can shoot you, but you can't shoot them. Again, always fun. On top of that, you can only shoot straight ahead or diagonally up, but never straight up, and you can only shoot diagonally while you're moving. Basically, the game does everything it can to be a pain in the ass. In fact, the whole thing just really doesn't seem finished. A common theme here with these games is that I could only make it to the second level, and here it's just no different. I made it to the past where I'm fighting street thugs with a rapid fire shotgun, and for some reason you're on the rooftops and you'll die if you fall too far, even if there's a platform below you. If you do fall too far, you'll die, which is realistic, but not in a game like this. It sucks. The amount of trial and error here is crazy, and the nonsensical layout of the platforms and poor collision detection, coupled with the fact that you'll be doing a lot of blind jumps, just make this so annoying to play. Also on this level, you fight helicopters every few minutes, but for some reason, when a helicopter comes on screen, you can't move or jump. You're glued to the spot and have to kill it as quickly as possible, but there's literally no way to avoid their attacks, so you just have to hope you have enough health to make it through. Of course, at one point I had to fight 3 in a row, and even when I got to that part with full health, it wasn't enough to get by. Absolute bullshit. And you probably don't need to be told, but there's no checkpoints in this game either, so die once and you do get a few lives, but it's back to the start of the level every time. Awful game, stay far away. And finally, for the first film, here is the Terminator for the Sega CD, and hold on, this one is actually pretty damn good. It's a cross between the Mega Drive and SNES versions in that it's a run and gun, but with more emphasis on exploration. You again play as Kyle Reese, and you'll be taking on Terminators before heading to the past to stop the Terminator and bang Sarah Connor. The graphics here are great with some excellent animation, and the game just overall controls really well. The levels have a decent amount of health pickups and weapon pickups for you, and this was a hard game to put down. It's still not an easy game, but it is a fair challenge this time, and you can beat it by playing it a few times and not having to rely on cheap tricks to get through. Also, the music is absolutely amazing, and the use of the CD technology here is really put to good use. I recommend trying this game as it is an absolute blast, and why this couldn't have been the version we got on the other consoles that people actually bought, I'll never know. Terminator 2 now, and here is the NES version. Oh boy. It's a side-scrolling action game where you play as Arnie's T-800 for the most part. The game starts off with you having fist fights with bikers, who of course don't have too much trouble taking down a Terminator with sticks, just like in the movie. Also, you, as the Terminator, have channeled your inner Usain Bolt, as you can run and move at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Now, to be fair, I'm actually kind of glad you do move fast, as it means the game has a good pace. But it's just not what a Terminator does, let's be honest. In fact, the game is even inconsistent with itself, and every level feels like it's from a different game. The second stage sees you reenacting the famous scene in the storm drains being chased by the T-1000 while you're on a motorbike, but holy shit, it's so annoyingly hard as you have to avoid obstacles that come at you really fast while shooting the T-1000 in his truck, as well as shooting doors ahead of you so they're open for you to drive through. Of course, if you touch anything just once, you die, and yep, you only get one life. So die once and it's back to the start of the game. Thank fuck for save states. Make it through that hell, and you're in the hospital rescuing Sarah Connor, who's been locked up for being a crazy bitch. Here you have to enter every room looking for keys to the elevator and make it to the top of the stage. Great. Now, the graphics in the game aren't actually that bad, and the controls are okay. But as with all these games, it's just tedious to play thanks to the blatant and cheap unfair difficulty. There were times where I thought I was having fun with the game, but would soon throw something my way to remind me that I wasn't enjoying it really. This is another one to avoid. The Master System version is basically the same game but with better graphics, but somehow they managed to really mess up the controls, so the combat is now a hell of a lot less responsive here. Also, for some reason they have taken out the second level where you're on the motorbike, though I'm not really complaining as that level was terrible. Other than that, it's basically the same game, which is not a good thing. Even though the controls are worse and the gameplay is slightly slower than the NES version, I probably would actually recommend this version, as it gets rid of the crap driving stage so you can actually have a slightly better time with it. And then there's the Game Gear version, which is the same as the Master System version but more zoomed in, so it looks a lot more pixelated. Other than that, basically everything I've said about the other versions apply here, so stay far, far away. Terminator 2 for the Game Boy is a very different game altogether, and actually is probably one of the better ones, as it's actually quite enjoyable. Here you play as Sarah Connor, but seemingly in the future, but we'll ignore that plot point. You're taking down waves of robot scum, and you'll actually have objectives to complete in the levels. I didn't realise this at first and assumed the whole thing was just the usual Terminator bullshit, especially as you only get one life again. But then I took the time to actually read the blurb at the start of each level, and it does clearly explain what you have to do on each level. After that, I did manage to get a few levels into the game, and actually had some fun doing so. The graphics are quite good, and what I really liked was the amount of stuff going on in the background, with hunter-killer robots flying in and out of the background, which was a really cool touch. The sound and music are nothing to shout about, and your weapon does make an annoying noise, but the game controls quite well, and even though it does have its fair share of bullshit, one life and it's back to the start again, it was pretty fun, and actually is one that I would go back and play again. Terminator 2 for the Super Nintendo is like a beefed up version of the NES game, but with a few gameplay changes. Here you're given a clear mission objective for each level, but as soon as you start playing you can tell it's gonna be rough. The control is very stiff, and you can walk around, punch and kick, and you also have the most useless jump I've seen in any video game. You'll be exploring, picking up weapons and figuring out how to complete some very cryptic mission objectives. The game actually looks alright, but it's just no fun to play. As always, the enemies just constantly respawn, and even though they aren't particularly tough, you can just tell that there's little to no thought gone into any of the placements or anything like that. They'll just follow you round, appearing literally out of nowhere, and will constantly attack you until you kill them. Then you get onto the second level where you're finding John Connor's house, and this honestly has some of the worst driving controls I've ever seen in a game. Once I finally did figure out how to just about control the bike, I was just driving around for longer than I wanted to with no idea where I was meant to go. I know that was kind of the point, as you have to track down his house, but by the time I'd already had enough. This is just no fun to play at all, and the terrible music didn't do anything to help. Another one to schedule for termination. The Mega Drive or Genesis version of the game is just the same as the Super Nintendo one, but the graphics aren't quite as good, but are pretty much the same. The music is still terrible, as is the gameplay and hit detection, so at least they were consistent there. In fact, I actually found this version harder than the SNES one, and I struggled even to get past the first stage. But all you really need to know is that this one sucks too. Stick it on the scrap heap. Terminator 2 also came home to a few computer systems. Here is the DOS version. It's another one of those games where every level seems like a different game altogether, and it's by LJN, which probably tells you all you need to know. Graphically, the game actually looks pretty good, with some massive sprites that have some good animation. The game even controls half decent, but again, it's the difficulty and the fact that you only get one life to make it through the whole thing that just makes it not fun to play these days. I'm aware that for most of these games, they're from a time where we didn't mind replaying the same levels over and over, getting slightly better each time, but even back then, these particular games weren't fun to play. The first thing you do is fight the T-1000 in what is actually an incredibly easy battle, and you just press the spacebar to shoot him, and if you do that right away, you immediately win. Then you have an annoying driving section where you're getting away from the T-1000 in his truck while you're on a bike, but touching anything hurts you, even puddles, and you have no time to react to the hazards as you can't really slow down, otherwise you'll be crushed by the evil liquid metal man. You do get some cool movie clips that are basically GIFs between levels, but it's not enough to make this game anything other than barely passable. If you have the patience, then you might enjoy this, but really it's not one to worry about. A version of this version was also released on the Commodore 64, and it's actually pretty similar overall, and believe it or not, I prefer this one, maybe because I could get the cheats to work. The game here has big sprites and surprisingly smooth and responsive controls. The colour palette isn't as varied as the DOS version of course, but the sounds are actually better here, which is surprising. But sadly, it's the tedious level design and lack of any real direction that ruins this game. I managed to get to a stage which is a puzzle where you have to fix the Terminator's arm, which is actually from the movie, which is cool, but I just had no idea what I was doing and nothing I tried seemed to work. I know I could have looked it up, but I just really didn't care enough. This still isn't particularly good, but I would say it's better than the DOS version. The motherfucking Amiga got a version of the game that is almost identical to the DOS version in terms of graphics and sound, but sadly the controls here are just awful and really unresponsive, so much so that I couldn't even get past the first level. I tried to beat the T-1000 a total of 12 times before deciding that was enough of my time I've wasted. I'll have to just assume that the rest of the game keeps this trend of not being very good, and just advise you all to leave this one well alone. T2, the arcade game, is exactly that, an arcade game based on the Terminator 2 movie. This is one of those cabinets that had a gun accessory and is actually one of the few games I put a few quid into in real life while I was growing up. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the arcade version to work, so we're going to take a look at the home releases of the game to see how they hold up. Starting with the SNES version, this is a first-person rail shooter where you control the on-screen cursor and you have a machine gun with unlimited ammo as well as a handful of rockets. Enemies will pop up on screen and you just have to take them down. Simple, right? Well, no, not really. There's always a ton of enemies on screen, and while they aren't always shooting at you, it's very hard to get rid of them all without taking damage. Also, they take quite a few hits to destroy, although I do recommend aiming for the head, as this does seem to take them out a lot quicker. Every level will slowly slide from left to right, and the levels really can go on for ages, with some of them lasting more than 10 minutes before you even get to the boss. This can make the game feel like it drags on a bit, and that's mainly because it does. Along the way, you'll be able to shoot boxes that contain power-ups. Your gun can overheat quite quickly, so some of the power-ups fix that, giving you some health, and you can also get rockets, shot power upgrades, and even a shield. I do like that all the power-ups are quite plentiful, so you never really have to worry about running out of rockets, which is nice. Some of them even home in on enemies, which is cool. Graphically, the game's actually quite good. Most of the enemies and characters are digitised sprites, and they look alright, but the animation is jerky on the human characters. The controls are fine, as it's just moving a cursor, but as you're using the D-pad, it can be hard to be precise. Other than that, there really isn't much to say. You move to the right, shooting everything you can. You get a few continues, which you'll definitely need, as the game's quite damn hard. It's not a terrible game, but it's also not that great. Probably the best Terminator on the SNES though. The Mega Drive or Genesis version of the game is basically the same, though the copy I played did have some issues. Pretty sure that was down to my totally legit copy that I have though. Here the game plays basically the same, but the graphics are slightly worse, but still not bad. The music is actually better here though, mainly because I couldn't really hear it in the SNES version. Some things aren't the same though. For example, your gun overheats way quicker here, and there's barely any sounds other than your weapon, and the player's HUD is slightly different. Though again, don't take all of this as gospel, as in my version I also couldn't take any damage, so maybe it wasn't a finished one. But even with the not being able to die, I still got bored by the 4th level. Again, the game is fine, there's just nothing really exciting about it. The Amiga version looks really good, and you can control it using the mouse, which makes things a lot easier. Also, I prefer the HUD here, as it's much cleaner. There isn't much in the way of sound, which is a bit odd, but the music is decent. This is probably the closest you can get to the arcade version at home, and even though the mouse control still isn't perfect, it's probably the best way to play it if you really have to. Which you don't, as it's not that much fun, thanks to the annoying enemies, unavoidable damage, and the levels that drag on for way too long. The Master System version is of course a very cut down one compared to the others, but surprisingly it's actually pretty good fun, and even though it's still got all the same problems in the other versions, I did find I had a good time with this one. The graphics aren't as good of course, but are still quite impressive for the system. The music sucks though, but the sounds are okay. And I would argue that the controls here are actually a bit better than the SNES and Mega Drive versions of the game. Overall, this still isn't really worth playing, but it's an impressive looking game for the system that could have been a hell of a lot worse. The Game Gear version is very similar to the Master System version, as is the usual, and is basically that game but zoomed in a bit. There isn't as much sound in this one, and it's basically just the music, but the gameplay itself is still relatively okay. The graphics are cool looking, and it runs at a smooth enough pace, even with a ton of enemies on screen. Again, it's just not that fun, but it's kind of impressive to see the action on the tiny screen. Now, I know what you're really here for, and that is T2 Chess Wars, yeah baby! It's chess with Terminator characters, which is actually a pretty sweet idea, but it still isn't good. It's chess rules, so you have to take it in turns to position your characters so they take out the others. The problem is that the game is so damn slow that it's just tedious to play. Also, the animation here is horrible and jerky, and to make things worse, the computer takes forever to take their move that I genuinely thought the game had crashed on me more than once. In fact, the graphics in general are just awful and look like they were done in Microsoft Paint. The music is pretty cool, but other than that, this is just bad. If they'd made it properly, then it would have been pretty cool, as I actually quite like chess and I love Terminator, so it could have been right up my street, but no, it sucks. Shame. It's time to finally move on to Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, which is not the most loved movie in the franchise, but it's actually good fun if you just switch off. And that kind of sums up this PS2 game based on the movie as well. It's a first-person shooter, which honestly is probably the best way to make a Terminator game. You play as Arnie's T-800, and as always, the game starts in the future, with you battling through the hordes of enemies in order to make it past and save John Connor. You do get some objectives on the way, but really all of these are just things you'll be doing naturally as you play through the levels, but that's fine. Graphically, the game isn't actually all that bad. It's certainly not much worse than most games of the time. Terminators look like Terminators, and there's actually some good animation in here. Arnie actually voices his character here, though he really seems like he couldn't care less while doing it, and you'll be hearing the same "excellent" when you kill enemies and pick up items all through the game. You get a decent amount of weapons and a good mix of lasers and bullet ones from the past. These all work quite well. What's nice is that the enemies are actually automatically targeted, then you can press the L1 button to lock onto the nearest one. This makes shooting very easy, but in a way that actually helps rather than being too easy. Also, the controls in general are actually quite good. They're responsive, if a little slow. The levels are littered with ammo and health, and I actually found the game to be quite easy, but that did help feel like I was actually an unstoppable killer robot. This is definitely still a game that is very rough around the edges, and is just about average at best, especially when it comes to the one-on-one fistfights you have with the various other Terminators, where the game turns into a beat-em-up, but not a very good one at all. You've got a few attacks and a grab, but everything just looks very ropey, and you can just spam the same moves over and over for the most part. Having said that, I would actually say this game's a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. I know it's not that good, but it really isn't as bad as the over-dramatic internet will probably tell you. Worth a look if you can find it cheap, and if you're happy just to switch off your brain for the 5 or so hours it takes to play through. Terminator 3 also got a game on the Game Boy Advance. This time though, it's an isometric action game. You are of course the Terminator, and you've got to complete 9 or 10 levels in the past, present and future, all with their own objectives. You'll never guess why, to save John Connor. The game looks alright with some pre-rendered graphics that seem to love doing on the Game Boy Advance. They look better in stills than when moving though, thanks to some very dodgy animation. There is a good variety in locations and enemies though. The levels are fairly large and you'll need to do a fair bit of exploring to complete your objectives, which isn't always as easy as it sounds. And some of them are very cryptic, which can be annoying. You'll fight a load of robot enemies throughout the game and the combat isn't too bad. You can move and shoot, and you press the L button to switch between 3 movement modes. You've got walk, run and strafe. Personally, I would have preferred just to double tap the button to run rather than having to select the run option, and then the L button could just be used to strafe. But hey, what do I know? I'm not a game developer. You get a few weapons and they're all okay to use. You even get secondary ones like grenades and C4. In fact, the C4 is actually quite precious as you need it to destroy key things in the levels, so make sure you don't waste it, as there were a few times where I ran out by accident and I had no choice but to restart the level, which is just bad game design. You'll also get a few driving levels here, which is a nice way to mix things up, though to be honest, they were probably my least favourite levels in the game. Unfortunately though, after initially thinking it wasn't too bad, the more I played, the less I actually liked this one. The weapons you get actually turn out not to be that effective, and later in the game, you seem to die incredibly easy, making it quite frustrating. You'll be able to get through it in a few hours though, and the game does save after every stage. And actually, I would say it's worth trying if you're a fan of all things Terminator, just don't expect a smooth ride. Next up is Terminator 3 Redemption. This is the GameCube version. This is the aptly named game that is still loosely based on the Terminator 3 movie and is a considerable improvement over the other game. This is a mix of third-person action stages, vehicle stages and rail shooter stages. You are the T-800 and most levels follow plot points from the movie. You'll start in the future being reprogrammed by the Resistance, and then you're taking on Terminators and other robot bastards before heading back to the past to save the world from Judgment Day, and of course dealing with that pesky TX. The game looks really good for the time, with some great character models, especially for your character. What's even cooler is that the more damage you take, the more of your flesh comes off, leaving your robo-endoskeleton exposed. It's touches like this that are really great. The levels themselves are all incredibly linear, with just one path to follow, almost like a Crash Bandicoot game with Terminators. In the third-person stages you can shoot enemies with a range of weapons, but what's cool is that you're pretty handy in hand-to-hand combat too, with a few different combos you can pull off, and depending on what you finish with, you can do different finishes, some of which let you steal energy from the enemy Terminators, which is really nice. It's a pretty cool mechanic, and you can also pick up signposts and other things to use against the enemy Terminators, which all looks pretty cool. The driving sections always have a time limit and a few objectives to complete. These are actually often quite very tricky, and most of them took me a good few tries to complete. You get a range of vehicles throughout the game, from future cars to motorbikes, trucks, police cars, and you can even take over enemy tanks. What's cool is that when you're driving a vehicle, if you get close enough to another one, you can jump onto it and take control of it. So if the one you're on is about to blow up, just get close to another one and steal their motor. The variety of stages is decent, and most of them do involve driving, which I do kind of wish wasn't the case, as my favourite stages were always the ones on foot. But all of them are packed with action, and even though they can be confusing to start with, after a bit of practice you'll figure out what you need to do. Surprisingly, the game also has a co-op mode as well. Obviously I've got no friends, but I do know that the levels aren't the same as the single player game, and are actually much more difficult, but it's nice to have the option here. Overall, this was a really fun game, and one that surprised me way back when I bought it. Definitely recommend checking this one out. Don't worry, we're nearly done. It's time to look at the few games that aren't based on a movie and are their own thing, starting with Terminator 2029 for the PC. This is a first-person game where you play the role of a soldier who you create yourself. Well, actually you just name him. And then you set out on some missions doing stuff like killing robots. This is actually more like one of those old dungeon crawler games where you have a map at the bottom of the screen and you don't move smoothly. Instead, you move a square at a time. This makes it very confusing as to where you actually are and makes getting around the levels quite annoying, but if you concentrate mainly on the map at the bottom of the screen, you can get around. Unfortunately, even when you do get used to moving around, this game is just not fun to play at all. You have a super suit that you wear that is literally Boba Fett, and you can kit it out with weapons and accessories to help fight the Terminators, but even when you've done that, you die incredibly easily. The graphics here aren't terrible, but the animation is really choppy on enemies. Shooting them is easy enough though, as you use the mouse to attack, but I always felt just so underpowered. I really didn't have any fun with this game, and I doubt many people ever did. It sucks. Terminator Future Shock, also for the PC, was the first proper FPS game set in the Terminator universe. Well, actually it wasn't, as there was Terminator Rampage before it, but I couldn't get that one to load. In Terminator Future Shock, the story is the same as every other game really. You're part of the Resistance and you've got to stop Skynet from taking over. Hang on, is that the first time I've actually mentioned Skynet in this video? Damn, I am an amateur. Anyway, it's a first-person game that looks pretty dated now, but I do actually still kind of like the graphics. It's low polygon for the most part, and all the weapons you use are 2D sprites. You're thrown into some huge levels and have a number of objectives which are surprisingly varied. They involve blowing stuff up, driving to certain locations on the level, finding hostages and blowing up more stuff. This is all fine, but the main problem is that the levels are so huge and they're open areas and there's very little to no direction as where the hell you need to go. You do have a map, but I found it next to useless. You can enter almost every building you find too, but the trouble is it's really hard to tell them apart thanks to everything being blown to bits and looking kind of similar. I literally spent hours on some of the levels going around in circles. Even though I was crap at finding my way around, I did find myself keep coming back to the game as the controls, combat and general gameplay are actually really good. The mouse aiming is excellent here, and even though it takes forever until you see your first Terminator in the game, fighting the other robots' enemies is still fun. The draw distance here isn't particularly good, which is a shame, and it adds to the trouble of navigating the stages. Also, I would often forget my objectives, which didn't help, and I couldn't seem to find a way to look at them while I was playing outside of the briefing. This is probably just me pressing the wrong button though. The music is definitely another plus to this game, with some awesome variations on the theme song that play in the levels, and it really adds to the atmosphere. Overall, I really enjoyed playing this one, and have done since my brother first got a copy for our Packard Bell PC way back in the day. I would split my time between this and Realms of the Haunting. I had no idea what I was doing in either of the games, but I just enjoyed exploring the large environments, even if they were extremely barren in this game, and the shooting the stuff was always fun. Definitely recommend this one. Next up is Terminator Dawn of Fate for the PlayStation 2, which actually is so boring I'd actually forgotten that I even played and recorded footage for it, and therefore didn't even add anything to my script, so this is all going to be freestyle. Basically, this is a third-person action game set in the Terminator universe, where you do the usual thing of trying to stop Skynet from being a bunch of bastards. Graphically, the game actually looks quite good, but unfortunately just about everything else is a very big letdown. The controls are awkward, though they do work. You have a strange melee attack which is pretty good against all Terminators and takes them out very easily, but you will of course find a bunch of weapons along the way as well. All the levels are your usual post-apocalyptic ruins, and they all get very boring very quickly. Also, the annoying fixed camera means that it's really hard to find your way round. I really didn't enjoy playing this one and had to turn it off after just a few levels, as it was just so tedious to play. And finally for today, here is Terminator Resistance, released for modern consoles. This is the PS4 version. It's another first-person shooter where you are Mr. Jacobs, and this one is actually set in the time where Skynet has taken over and is working on the technology to create the infiltrated Terminators from the first movie. It's a really cool place to set the game, as you meet the very first model and all hell breaks loose because you spent months thinking it was an ally, but it turned out to be a Terminator infiltrator getting resistance information for Skynet. Then it hunts you down, so you've got to do the usual thing of destroying it and then getting to Skynet before they can create the time machine to send it back. But we all know how that ends up. Now what surprised me the most about the game is just how damn good it is. Graphically, I'll be honest, it's not the most impressive for the PS4, but it does look good with some great looking environments, enemies and lighting effects. But unfortunately the human characters look a bit ropey and have some very crappy lip sync, which is a shame. But you can kind of tell that this isn't a AAA title, though it's not that far off. As it's all set in the future, and the whole game is a wasteland, and it's actually quite linear, which I do actually kind of like. Each map is a large open area, though there are multiple side missions in each one that you do have to unlock from talking to survivors in your base before you start the mission. Most of these are fetch quests, but they all give you XP, as well as killing enemies, and you'll level up as you play, letting you unlock new skills for your character. I always like these mechanics, and even though it's very basic stuff here, like lockpicking, hacking or getting more health, or letting your weapons do more damage, I did often have trouble deciding what I needed to upgrade, though by the end of the game you pretty much have everything you need. There are a few different enemies in the game, from small scout robots to T-800s to huge hulking mechs that are really hard to put down, and the game does a good job of making you understand that Terminators are a real threat. If you run in guns blazing, it's not going to end well for you, as you can't take too many hits. Though later on in the game you do get much more powerful weapons, and you can even upgrade them. This does make you really pick and choose your battles though, especially as not all weapons can hurt all enemies, which makes sense. Even for the basic T-800s you need laser or explosive weapons. Regular bullets won't do jack shit, but they can still be useful, as something like a shotgun won't actually hurt them, but do a close range blast and you can knock them off their feet to buy you some time to run away. You'll be doing a lot of sneaking around here, and you have that typical magic vision thing that every game has now that lets you see through walls to see where enemies are, and you will probably use it quite a lot, but it doesn't have an amazing range, so you can't always rely on it. This is actually a nice decision though, and does keep you on your toes. As you explore the levels, you'll find scraps and materials that you can trade for items or use to craft new ones, with more powerful and useful things being available as you upgrade your crafting ability. You can also hack into terminals, doors, gun turrets, and things like that to get entry to new places, as well as have some help by turning Skynet's weapons against its own kind. I really did have a lot of fun playing this game, but it's not perfect. Sometimes the combat doesn't seem really balanced or even consistent. Enemies do have weak spots, but I found that sometimes they'd go down way quicker than others. My biggest problem though are the load times, which are just crazy. It takes forever to load, and every time you die you've got to wait over a minute for it to reload your last checkpoint. And there's times when you're stuck in a battle and will die over and over while you figure out the strategy, wasting loads of time waiting for the damn loading screen to finish. Also, the detection system doesn't always seem quite right. Enemies will sometimes spot you when they really shouldn't, and their suspicion bar continues to rise even when you've gone behind cover. These are minor gripes really though, and overall it is a solid game that I heard was good, but I didn't think I'd have half as much fun with it as I have done. Most importantly, you can really tell that the devs here are massive fans of the Terminator franchise, as the game is packed with references and nods to the movies, including a doppelganger for Robert Patrick's T-1000 early on in the game, but at this point he's still just a human that's been captured, and it's clear that they're using him as a template for the T-1000. It's a really cool way to do it, and I'd never had any issue exploring every inch of the levels to find these little touches. This really is a must-play for any fan of the Terminator series. It is quite short, and like I mentioned, it is very linear, but it's well worth playing through. Oh, and yeah, you're even rewarded a few times throughout the game by your female companions, if you manage to treat them well enough, that is. This is highly recommended. So there you go, a load of Terminator games. It's not all of them, but it's enough. Which one is your favourite? Let us know in the comments below. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so why not do so? We've got loads of cool content for everyone to enjoy. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.